When did gerrymandering, or the act of creating districts that strongly favor one political party or another, become important in American history? And the concept, the idea of gerrymandering, comes from Elbridge Gerry, spelled the same, pronounced differently. I don't know why. But if you, this is such a piece of trivia, but if you're driving in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near the BB&N school there on the river, that road is actually Gary's Landing Road. It's short, but your GPS will tell you it's Gary's Landing, and I think there's a sign for it. That's Elbridge Gerry, for whom we got the name gerrymandering. He didn't like it. And it was called gerrymandering because the district that his political party drew looked like a salamander. So it's a combination of Gary and salamander. So we get gerrymander. That there was so what you see from that is there was always this idea of wiggling a bit to try and get a district that favored your side versus another. But what computers have done is they have enabled this sort of surgical gerrymandering to either crack or pack are the two major ways that you gerrymander. To crack a population is to say, and I'm going to use this as, I will say Democrats and Republicans, you could say oranges and apples or whatever, but you either take your opponents and you crack them. So if they have a majority, you break them apart and move them into districts so that they no longer have a majority, or you pack them. You take as many of your opponents as you possibly can and you shove them into one district. So yeah, they're going to go ahead and be able to elect somebody in their one district, but not in any of the other places where they might otherwise have been. So it's cracking and packing. And that really became the plan of the Republican Party in 2010. So what happened is this. Reagan wins in 1980 and takes office in 1981 with this idea that you can cut taxes dramatically and still maintain services, because what he argued was that if you cut taxes, there would be such extraordinary investment, private investment in the economy, that the economy would grow hugely. And the taxes that remained on that economic growth would be enough to continue to power all the other ways that people wanted the government to act. And even when he talked about it, people thought it wasn't going to work. And if you're old enough to remember, the man who became his vice president, George H.W. Bush, called what he was talking about voodoo economics. That's what he meant. He's like, this doesn't work. This is voodoo economics. Well, in fact, it was voodoo economics. It's never actually worked. It never significantly goosed economic growth, and it never produced the kind of tax revenue it was supposed to. But it became sort of this article of faith among the Republicans that if you cut taxes, you were going to create economic growth that was going to make it possible to continue to have services, even though you weren't really getting, taxing corporations and the very wealthy. And what's happened since 1981, between 1981 and 2021, more than $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1%. But the first set of tax cuts happens in 1981, and the Republicans want to do another major tax cut in 1986, and they're aware that Americans don't like the cuts to regulations and the cuts to social programs that have happened in the first of Reagan's terms. So in 1986, the Republican Party starts to manipulate the voters so that they can stay in power. And they're not hiding this. They talk about ballot integrity is what they talk about, but they also say that Democrats are cheating with voter fraud, that's how they're going to win, is through voter fraud. It's always been a rhetorical device. There really is, I keep making the point, there is almost no voter fraud in the United States of America. There has traditionally been a lot of election fraud, which is when you try and steal an election by manipulating the way it works. So beginning in 86, they start to talk about ballot integrity, and they start to talk about knocking Democratic voters off the rolls, primarily Black voters. And we have this because there was a lawsuit, and all in the discovery showed their memos to each other talking about this. And then they quickly realize that what they're doing is not popular. And after Clinton gets elected in 92, because we have the George H.W. Bush presidency, and he says, dudes, we gotta stop cutting taxes because look at the deficits, which have tripled under Reagan. And the Clinton gets elected in 92. And in 93, the Democrats, through the Motor Voter Act, and make it easier to register to vote. And that really sends the radical Republicans sort of ballistic, saying they're planning to cheat, they're planning to cheat. And in 94, they accused two Democrats of a senator and a member of the House of Representatives of cheating in order to be elected. And they hold open these investigations to prove that there was voter fraud going on. And they never turn anything up, but they keep it in the news all the time. And that's where you really start to see that pattern of using investigations to seed the idea of malfeasance on the part of the Democrats, just to sort of, where there's smoke, there's fire. So we're going to keep this investigation going. But what happens is that you start to seed this idea. And then, of course, they impeach Clinton and expect that that's going to kill his candidacy, his presidency. And in fact, he's more powerful after the impeachment, more popular after the impeachment than he is before it. So anyway, they don't expect after the election of 2000, when you get George W. Bush, that Americans are ever going to go back to the Democrats, and they're really thinking that this is going to be a permanent Republican majority and so on. And then voters elect Barack Obama. And this is a crisis for the radical Republican Party in a number of different ways. But one of the ways in which it is a huge crisis is that they really thought they had a permanent lock on the presidency. And even to the point that, the George W. Bush in 2000 didn't win the majority of the popular vote, but they had the popular vote through the they had the Electoral College. It's very hot here. And that, of course, that election that gave the presidency to George W. Bush is thanks to Florida, where more than 1,000 people had been kicked off the rolls between 1998 and 2000, in addition to the hanging chads and so on and so forth. But anyway, Obama gets elected, and this is a huge crisis. So Obama gets elected in 2008, takes office in 2009. And what the Republicans say then, and I keep emphasizing that these are not traditional Republicans. These are not George H.W. Bush Republicans, certainly not Eisenhower Republicans. These are the radicals who took over the party. In 2010, they go to their donors and they say, we can make sure that we continue to maintain control of Congress, even if we're going to lose the White House on occasion. And they do it through something called Operation Red Map, and that stands for, its operation is a normal kind of capitalization, but Red Map is all caps, and it stands for the Republican Redistricting Majority Project, Operation Red Map. And what they do is they make sure that the Republicans pour money into state legislatures in 2010. And this would be North Carolina and Michigan and Kansas and Ohio, and there's a lot of them. And what they do is North Carolina, did I say that one? They take those states that are purple states, and they guarantee that there is a Republican majority in the legislature for the 2010 redistricting. Because remember, according to the Constitution, we have a census every 10 years. And one of the things that census does is it enables the state legislatures to divvy up the state in districts, both for the Congress and for for state legislature seats, that will enable them to fairly represent the people in that state. So after 2010, Operation Red Map was in place in these states, and they put in place extraordinary gerrymanders. So states like North Carolina, which is really purple. I mean, North Carolina is just pretty much 50-50 of a state. The Republicans could get the vast majority of the seats because of redistricting. So it's a very long way to answer the idea that it was really 2010 when it goes off the charts, and it's been a long time sort of clawing that back in a number of states. But one of the things in those states is that nobody likes this except the people who get elected under it. Quite literally, even the Republicans who are advantaged by this, most of them don't want it either, because what it does is it means that in a district like Marjorie Taylor Greene's or Lauren Boebert's in Colorado, I'm sorry. The people, those might be Republican districts for sure, but in the Republicans who live there don't want to be represented by a wacko. They want somebody who shares their principles. But when you have that extremely gerrymandered a district, what the lawmakers are afraid of is not that they will lose to a Democrat. They're worried they will lose to somebody more extreme than them because it is a Republican district. They are going to win. And so what it's done is it's dramatically pushed the Republican Party to the right. So what are you seeing right now? We redistrict every 10 years after the census. And right now, President Donald Trump is trying to get Texas to redistrict now in the middle of the decade in such a way that it will enable the Republicans to pick up 5 more seats, even though there hasn't been a new census or anything. This is purely a power grab. And for the first time, you are seeing Democratic governors saying, if you do that in Florida, if you do that in Texas, we will do it in California, Illinois, and New York. And we're gonna get rid of everything you can accomplish with these gerrymanders. And I will point out that at least one of the gerrymanders that was in place in 2024, I'm all confused about what year we're in, was found to be illegal, and the courts let it stay in place until after the election. And without those gerrymanders in those states, the Republicans would not have control of the House of Representatives. So it matters. Senate's different, remember, because that's a statewide election. But the House of Representatives is really moved by the districting maps. Hi, folks. Welcome back to History and Politics chat at 4 o'clock on Tuesday, where I try and give some context to the history behind the news and what's actually happening in it. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but when I do these conversations, I do not speak for my employer. All right, so let me get to the questions that got crashed out by thunder and lightning last week, where I warned you I might get lost, and I did, in fact. You heard that giant crash, and we lost power for about 4 hours. Don't worry, I figured out it wasn't coming back, and I went kayaking. So, and just when something like that happens to me, in any case, I live in the woods. It's not at all uncommon for us to lose power. Most of us have generators, and in the winter we heat by wood. So we're unless you hear otherwise, I'm safe. I'm just using a candle instead of a light switch. All right. So there's a bunch of questions today, and I wanted to start with one that is more applicable, I think, today than it was last week, and that is that. A number of people have asked about what's going on with Social Security and disability insurance, and what does it mean to say that those are potentially in danger? And the answer to that, as I've talked about, I think before, is that Social Security and disability insurance are funded, Social Security entirely, and disability insurance in part. They're actually both funded by trusts, and the money that goes into those trusts is different. So Social Security depends entirely on what I'm going to tell you about, and disability depends in part on it. And those are funded by payroll taxes. And payroll taxes are literally that. They are taxes that come out of your paycheck. So you have to be working for this to affect you. And if you look at your pay stub, these are the things that show up under FICA, the Federal Insurance Contributions Act. So that's a FICA payroll tax, or if you are self-employed, it comes out as SECA, Self-Employment Contributions Act. And the way it works is that when you get a paycheck, the federal government takes a portion of that money out of your paycheck and puts it toward Social Security and in part toward disability insurance. And then when you need those things, you draw on them. Okay, so what's happened and what went into place today, so they're paid for by payroll taxes. You would bring that money home if it didn't come out of your paycheck. And for FICA, your employer matches that. So if you put in, and I'm making these numbers up, if you put in $5, they put in a sum of money as well, usually $5 as well. And if you're self-employed, you have to pay both sides of it. And that's because that's the way the law is written, which is kind of hard on people starting out new businesses. So if we got rid of those payroll taxes, you will take home more money. And that's the argument behind getting rid of payroll taxes. And that's why President Trump does not like payroll taxes, because he doesn't like that it means that both that you're going to take home less money, which you could have in your pocket and then use to jumpstart the economy, and that that employers don't have that money either, because they're the ones who have to put in their side of things. Today, which is September 1st, what went into effect was one of the executive memoranda from, actually the term is officially memorandums now. I don't know, believe me. But anyway, is one of the executive memorandums from the beginning of August, when President Trump got frustrated because the Congress was not, and his negotiators, Steve Mnuchin and White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, were not able to come up with any kind of a coronavirus bill. And he just said, well, I'll take care of it. And he did that through 4 instruments, 3 memorandums and 1 executive order. The executive order had very little by way of teeth, by the way. But anyway, he can't change the law. What he could do was delay collection of the payroll tax. So beginning today, employers do not have to collect payroll taxes. Now, but here's the trick. The law still stands. So what he's done is he's deferred the payment of those payroll taxes into 2021 with the idea that if he is reelected and Republicans are in charge of Congress, they will make that cut legitimate and permanent. So the idea is that he's deferred the taxes with the hope that the law will change and that will all go away. If that doesn't happen, though, those taxes are still going to have to be paid. And so let me move that back to the present. Today is the day that memorandum went into effect. But real question, are employers really going to defer the collection of that tax? Because it's going to be a nightmare. What are you going to do? Say to people in January of next year, oh, oopsie poopsie, we're going to go ahead and claw back all the money you were supposed to pay last year? Or are they suddenly going, and then they're going to have to put in a big chunk? And that will, of course, have required, since most people are paid by, not everybody, of course, but since so many people are paid by direct deposit and it's all computerized, you got to reprogram everything possibly twice. So it's not at all clear that that's going to go into effect. I do think it's interesting, if you have checked, that the Dow has the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is one of the ways that people measure how well the stock exchange is doing, has jumped dramatically today. The day that this payroll tax cut was slated to go into, not tax cut, deferment was slated to go into effect. All right, so that's what's happening in the short term, right? In today and over the next couple of months. But why does Trump want to do that? And this actually bleeds into something else that somebody asked. So I'm going to run with it right now, and that is that I know it often looks as if the Republican Party is, especially under Trump, is doing stuff really willy-nilly. And it's very hard for a lot of people to put those things together. Like where's this payroll tax cut come from? And why that? And why do we have corporate tax cuts? And why is there drilling in the Arctic? And why, and sometimes it just seems like it's mean-spirited. And obviously, I'm not going to editorialize here. I have ideas about that. But let me explain to you what they are trying to do. When somebody like one of the 4-letter guys, I think both of them actually, Rand Paul and Paul Ryan. As I've said before, I have a hard time when the words all have the same number of letters in them. And then you got the father in there too. Anyway, when they talk about getting rid of Social Security and getting rid of Medicare, and when people talk about getting rid of Obamacare and that's the Affordable Care Act that provides exchanges on which people can buy health insurance that does not discriminate against pre-existing conditions, for example. When they talk about these things, a lot of people look at that and they say, of course, that's never going to happen. Who would put up with that? Americans love those things. Why would you do that? Well, why you would do that is part of an ideology that has had a lot of popularity in America over our history. And most recently, of course, it was the ideology in place during the 1920s. And afterward, there was the reactionary group of people who hated the New Deal, hated a new kind of concept of what the government should do that went into place during the 1930s and the 1940s, and said this was going to pervert American society. So what does this mean? What it means is that if you, people like the people who believe in the kind of ideology that I'm going to talk about, known now as movement conservatives, but they were mainstream Republicans in the 1920s. They weren't after World War II. But what they believed was that there was that capitalism and democracy went hand in hand, and that if the government regulated business, if you had a business, and I'm going to use the male pronoun here because that's really what they're talking about when they talk. The reality, of course, on the ground is very different. Women have businesses and all that, but when they talk, they're talking about men for the most part. So if you're a guy who has a business and the government comes in and says, you got to pay your workers a certain amount of money. You can't work them that hard as you're working them. You can only work them for 8 hours a day, and you have to give them time to have lunch, and you have to give them weekends off, and you can't have machines that are going to hurt people. So one of my great examples about this is that, the word to mangle, like you mangle something, that actually comes from the machine called a mangle. And a mangle was something that was in laundries in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And by the way, you can go online and you can search. You can still buy a household mangle. Somebody actually left me one in her will once. And another word for it is a linen press. It weighed 16 gazillion pounds. And believe me, there was nothing in my house that was in danger of being mangled. But so I was very happy to let somebody who badly wanted it take it. But what that is, a mangle was a piece of superheated metal, and it's a whole machine, but the pieces that matter are a superheated piece of metal and a roller that held onto that metal really, really tight. And what you would do if you worked in a laundry, or if you had one at home, the ones at home now have brakes on them, like a chainsaw would, so they're safe now, but they didn't have that in the 19th century. If you were working in a laundry, you would push the clothing, especially sheets, in between the hot metal and the pressure of the mangle, and you'd push that in, and it would emerge fresh and clean and without seams in it. Without wrinkles in it. But the problem was that that machinery in the 19th century and early 20th century had no protections on it. So it would, if you push too close and you got your fingers cut, your arm would get dragged into the machine and mangled. It would get destroyed. In that extraordinary heat and pressure, your arm would get torn off, basically. So anyway, to go back, so that's where we get words like mangle. All right, so let me go back though to that ideology, and that ideology is that if you start to put those sorts of restrictions around a business owner, saying they have to pay a certain amount of money, or that air has to be filtered in a certain way through the factory, or they can't dump crap in the sewers, what you're doing is you are limiting what they can do. You are attacking their liberty. And the reason that matters in this ideology is that freedom matters, of course, in the democratic system, because a man needs to be free in order to vote freely and therefore elect people who accurately represent the body politic. But it also means that in order to do those things, in order to put the guard on the mangle, in order to clean the air in the factory, in order not to work people all for 15 hours a day or something, it's going to cost money. It's going to actually cost money. It's going to mean that people are going to have to spend money on air filtration systems. They're going to have to upgrade their mangles. They're going to have to actually invest money in ways that they do not choose to do. At the same time, how are you going to guarantee that those things take place? You're going to have inspectors. And those inspectors are going to come around and they're going to say to people, your air's not clean enough, or you're dumping sewerage in the streets, or whatever. And what you are doing then is you are taking, this is going to matter, by the way, in a minute, you are taking money from that businessman and you are giving it to the government. And that government, in turn, is hiring people who are going to take that money in their paychecks, who are going to be overseeing the business people. And therefore, the government is actually intruding on the liberty of that individual businessman. All right. So if that's the case, there's a couple of things going on. There's the problem of regulations, which is really what drove people like in the 1950s, people like William F. Buckley Jr. or Barry Goldwater in the 1960s. There's a problem with that, but then there's this other problem that starts during the New Deal. So regulation is a huge deal in the 1890s and the 1900s, but during the New Deal, there's another problem for people who are concerned about business and about the links between democracy and capitalism. And what they look at is the policies of the government after the New Deal, or during the New Deal, that actually provide programs to level the playing field, the economic playing field in America. So programs, for example, that try and stabilize the agricultural product going onto the market. Programs that provide jobs for jobless people. Programs that try and guarantee basic wages. Things that are in place to level the playing field. And the problem with those, from the perspective of somebody who doesn't like them, is that those cost tax dollars. Those literally are going to take money out of the pockets of people who have money, and they're going to put it into programs and into people to enforce those programs for people who don't have money. So these things are literally a redistribution of wealth from people who have money to people who don't have money. All right, so in America, I hope, by the way, this is interesting. I actually love the ideological piece of all this. Obviously, I suspect you're going to hear me in a second. I'm not defending this. I'm trying to explain this because there is an ideological basis for it. It is a coherent ideological argument. It really is. It's one that there is a countervailing ideological argument to be made, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I just want people to understand, so often, you hear, and I've had this conversation with somebody recently going, Trump will never cut Social Security. And I said, well, yes, he will. Now, he may not get it through Congress because the Democrats have a very different way of looking at the world. But this is ideologically coherent with going ahead and opening up the Arctic, for example, for exploitation by oil companies. Because what you want to do is you want to free up business. Now, why do you care so much about business being able to do whatever the heck it wants, which is basically what I have just described? You want that because you believe that the way the world works is for innovation to be let loose. That if in fact you let men do, when they're talking about men, you want people to be able to do anything they want to do because that's how you innovate. That's how you move the ball forward. You take people, let them rise to the top, and then you make sure they have all the running room they need. And as they do that, as they begin to accumulate money, as they get better and better at what they do and build bigger and bigger factories, they're going to run the country more and more efficiently, the way Andrew Carnegie did, for example. The idea there is that, what you're really going to do is you're going to turn these people loose and you're going to let them go. And the inherent in that ideology is the idea that most people really aren't like that. I mean, most of us are really kind of happy just doing our jobs and not innovating. And you don't really want us in charge of the country because we're going to get all bogged down. It's going to turn into a muddle, and there won't be any of this driving force that this ideology promises to release into society. So when you look at things like, why would you cut Social Security and and disability insurance? The answer to that is because if you do that, what you're going to do is you're going to get rid of those taxes that are redistributing wealth from hard workers, these innovative guys, and distributing it back to people who just weren't good enough to figure out how to organize their lives in such a way that they needed money. All right, so there is an ideological argument behind it. Now, here's the other side and why there is this ongoing struggle in America between these two sides, between that ideology and the ideology that I'm going to describe. That ideology was one that the Confederates, the big planters, not the small planters in the American South before the Civil War, who tended to enslave one, maybe two people, and to work alongside them. I'm talking about the entrepreneurs, the guys who had, large plantations. Maybe many of them, like Wade Hampton III, had 5 plantations, all of which he worked, of course, with enslaved workers. And interestingly enough, when people like Hampton did that, they had this ideology that said that the white guys running things, were the hard workers, and that the people actually doing the work, and mind you, the work of a plantation, you shouldn't think of a plantation like a farm, which many people do. Think of it as a town, because the enslaved peoples in a plantation are not only hoeing in the fields, they're shoeing the horses, and they're building things, and they're cooking, and they're doing everything that makes things work. But to the large planters like Wade Hampton, they think that they are the ones responsible for that success because they're the ones directing it. And they begin to articulate this idea, and they're the first to articulate it, but it gets picked up again for various reasons. Was there a big jump there in various reasons, just so you know. But for various reasons, in the 1880s and the 1890s, in the American urban centers and in the American West. And what people argue is that, you could really make America work great if you could just get rid of the idea that there should be regulation, that there should be any kind of leveling of the playing field in America between, in the late 19th century, white Americans and African Americans. That's one of the things that really is a burr under the saddle of people who want to free up this liberty, is the idea that the federal government is trying to protect the equality of opportunity for African Americans after the Civil War. That's really when all this is articulated. And in the 1870s, people who object to Black rights increasingly talk about this redistribution of wealth, and they call it socialism. They insist that this is socialism. I want to be really clear here. This is not 20th century socialism. It is not. It is not. They get the word in that early period from some of the social reforms of the 1840s and the 1850s, when everybody's calling everything socialism. There is not yet any kind of articulated governmental system of socialism that is going to get such notoriety in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But in America, we have brought these two things together under the same word, socialism. They are not the same. Anyway, in the 1870s, people who are opposed to Black rights begin to talk about how Republican efforts to level the playing field amongst white people and Black people is actually a form of socialism, because what it does is it permits lawmakers, and some of them are Black, but mostly it's just that they are willing to work with Black people. Most of them are white. They're going to put lawmakers in power who are trying to level the playing field, and that's going to cost tax dollars. And in the 1870s, they're really concerned about tax dollars being spent on things like roads and schools and all the contracts that those things are going to cost. They're worried about it in the South amongst Black people. They're worried about it in the North amongst immigrants who run the cities and say, we kind of need, schools. So you get in the 1890s, again, this idea that if only you could get rid of those things, America would thrive. And finally, in the 1920s, after the landslide election of 1920, when we get the election of Warren G. Harding, which is itself a really interesting election, in part because of how we got there, and in part because Harding is kind of a placeholder. I mean, Harding's Alice Roosevelt said, he wasn't a bad man, he was just a slob. And he himself said, this position is way too big for me. So it's funny that people turned out in a landslide for Harding, but what they did is they also put the Republican Party, which is at the time was the group that embraced this ideology, into power in the White House, so the executive branch, and in both houses of Congress. And what they did is they said, this is great. We're going to do this now. We're going to get rid of all that regulation. We're going to get rid of attempts at social welfare that were put in place in the 19aughts and the 19-teens. We're going to really free up the world for business. And that's the period when you get people like Herbert Hoover at the Secretary of Commerce and Andrew Mellon at Treasury going ahead and really taking the reins of society, and where you get the legend that Calvin Coolidge, who is going to step into Harding's shoes after Harding dies, probably of a heart attack out in California. What you get looks great. I mean, if you look at the 1920s, the way they are portrayed in the newspapers and the magazines, they look just ducky. And people like Calvin Coolidge say, he doesn't actually say this, he says something close to it though, the business of America is business. And what their argument is that if you really free up businessmen to do their thing, what you're going to end up with is this world where you have freed up innovation, you have freed up people to make radios and nylon stockings and refrigerators and toasters and new clothes and Chris Craft engines, Chris Craft boats and cars and radios, and everybody's standard of living is going to increase, and everything's going to be just so great that you don't have to worry about inequalities in society anymore and the fact that some people don't have access to things. Now, the reality, of course, was that was all an image. But the argument was that if you just could do this, get rid of these people carping on how you needed to have regulation and needed to have social welfare programs, you really could make society boom. Well, of course, the whole thing comes crashing down in October of 1929, and you have the ensuing depression. And at that point, you get the rise of this other ideology put into place by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, along with the aid of Democrats and progressive Republicans, by the way, from the West, during the 1930s, and then really taking off during the 1940s in order to fight World War II. And what this new ideology says, it's a really interesting ideology because it's really seat of the pants. I mean, I'm going to make it sound like they knew what they were doing, but the reality was that literally FDR says, hey, well, let's try one thing. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And they're constantly experimenting to see what actually works and what doesn't. And I'm going to come back. I hope I'll remember to come back to that in a bit. I'm going to write that down. So what they do is they experiment, and they realize that in order to make capitalism and democracy both succeed, you really can't have unregulated capitalism. Because what that does is it enables those few people, the first people out of the box, to go ahead and not only to have a great business, what they're going to do is they're going to monopolize resources, and then it's a really weeny step to them actually taking over the governmental system and using it to solidify their own economic power and then their own political power. So you see this dramatically in the 1880s and the 1890s when you have these guys like Carnegie who came to America as a bobbin boy. I mean, he was poor. He was an immigrant from Scotland. He actually came on a ship called the Wiscasset. A little bit of trivia there. With the Wiscasset, the Mid-Coast Maine used to be a major shipbuilding area, and Wiscasset was actually not one of the major ports, but obviously somebody knew somebody. Maybe it was built in Wiscasset. I don't know. I assume it was built out of Bath. But I just love that he came on a ship that was from Mid-Coast Maine, or at least named after somebody in Mid-Coast Maine. Anyway, when he came, it was possible to go ahead and rise the way he did, as he did. But those moments when people can really just do anything are few and far between. We've seen it in the .com rise and fall in our own era, but before that with computers and Bill Gates. If Bill Gates were my son today, he wouldn't be able to get anywhere because that field is crowded now. So anyway, what they discovered with people like Andrew Carnegie was that he did work his way up, but then he made the mistake of thinking that everybody else could. And one of the things that and I shouldn't pick on him so much because he was less bad about it than other guys were, they begin to think that the way you run society is to protect their interests. So for all that people at the top of this system kept talking about doing it on their own, what they did is they took over Congress and they managed to organize the economic policies of the country in such a way that they all funneled money upward. So this, in the 1930s, FDR and his people recognized this, and they begin to figure out ways to level the playing field. And they do so really deliberately. What they say is that in order to protect democracy and to protect capitalism, both things that FDR cared a lot about. Now, at the time, people who opposed him called him a socialist. They said he was destroying America, and he kept saying, honey bunch, I made that up. He keeps saying that he is protecting capitalism and democracy, and he's very articulate about that. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. But he says, if you continue on this path of just turning everybody loose to do whatever they want, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with fascism, because fascism is a new idea about government that's developed in the 1920s under Benito Mussolini in Italy after World War I, when he's like, why can't we get socialism going? We can't get socialism going because people are weenies. I am paraphrasing, and you can't. They don't know what's good for them. So those of us who do know what's good for them have to take them in hand and make them move in one direction. And FDR looked at the rise of fascism and worried a lot about something similar coming to America. So what he tried to do was, if you will, to file the sharp edges off of capitalism to go ahead and protect democracy. And in order to do that, who's going to stand up to, the major figures in America in the 1920s? Nobody is big enough. Like, no worker is going to sit there and be able to take on a Rockefeller. So the entity that has to stand against those big guys is, in fact, according to FDR, the government. And you put the government in place with a nonpartisan civil service, because you don't want people working just for you, because then it's just a question of every time the government turns over. If you have a big government, you have to be really careful to make sure it's nonpartisan and the people who are in it are loyal to the country, not to a man. But if you construct this nonpartisan civil service, what you're going to do is you're going to make sure the government protects equality of opportunity across the board, and at the same time that will itself protect democracy, because nobody's going to be able to buy an election because everybody's going to be worth sort of the same amount, and everybody's sort of going to be okay, as opposed to a few people taking everything and keeping everyone else down. And we have, in the period between 1933, when FDR takes office, and 1981, when Ronald Reagan takes office, we have something that economists call the Great Compression. And that means that wealth and income in America start to compress, or actually do compress, and there's not that much difference between the very rich and the very poor. Before that, it was huge, then it gets compressed, and then we get the Great Divergence after 1981, when those things go whoop again, and you end up with money moving dramatically upward. So the whole time that Reagan and people after him talk about socialism and communism being a redistribution of wealth, because of that first ideology I talked about, in fact, wealth is dramatically moving upward in that period, not moving downward. So we have now in America one of the greatest splits in income that we've ever had, and we have much less economic mobility than most other developed nations. Now people don't believe that. They think there's real hope in America to move up. But the reality is, because of the way our laws and our social system based on those laws is constructed, that is no longer, that's a dream. It's no longer the reality for most Americans. All right, so to take you back here to what's going on with the payroll tax and with Social Security and disability insurance, you might look at those things, as I do, and say, we need those things to file the sharp edges off of capitalism. Because if we don't do that, what's going to happen is all the money's going to move to the top, and we're going to have a huge number of people who are not in that less than 1%, who don't believe in the system. They don't believe they're getting anywhere. They're going to be extremely dangerous, either by attacking the system for economic reasons, or by attacking the system by grabbing hold to some kind of ideology that offers them hope. Some kind of religion, for example, and I have compared and do compare the rise, for example, not entirely, but the rise of QAnon as this, a religion, if you will, that addresses what's going on right now with this sense in America that people at the bottom can't possibly rise. They need something to tell them they know something that nobody else does. So you and I might look, or I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak for you. I look at Social Security, disability insurance. Education is even more special than that, but roads and schools and all the things that I think we need to make society function. I believe in what was known as the liberal consensus, the New Deal, the idea that the government has a role to play in regulating business. It has a role to play in saying, no, we don't want to develop the Arctic, or no, we want to protect the Grand Canyon, or no, you can't pour crap into the air and we need clean water. I believe the government has a role in regulating business, and in regulating workers' hours, protecting workers, and that it has a role in providing a basic social safety net, so that people have Social Security insurance, they have disability insurance, they have unemployment benefits, and that the government should also invest in infrastructure, which also costs tax money. But not everybody believes that. So when people say there's no way Trump would take on Social Security, yes, he would, because that fits a different ideology. Now, the problem for modern day Republicans is that they've supported people by convincing them that that taxation actually only benefits people of color and feminist women. Of course, that's not true. But the problem is that most Americans actually like the things that the liberal consensus provides. They like bridges that stay up. They like clean water. They like clean air. Mind you, lots of people want to argue about what that looks like. You may not like the regulation that, you got to paint your lobster ropes purple in order to protect the right whales. I hear a lot about that. You might not like that. And I might think that's great. I don't actually have a dog in that fight. But most of us think, even though we disagree with what the government should actually do, we think it should do something. These other people don't think it should do anything, and that by having it do things, that is actively hurting the country's ability to move forward. So that's probably more, I want to say it's more than you wanted to hear about, because what I just did there was I talked about Social Security, which people were interested in, but I also talked about why some people might want to get rid of some of the programs that most of us think are really good. Why would you want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act? You would want to tweak it for sure. You might want to rewrite it. But the idea that Americans should have health care when every other country, developed country in the world does, why is that in any way controversial? It's controversial because there is this other way of looking at the world that says the minute the government starts to do these things, it's going to cost tax dollars. And when it costs tax dollars or regulates business, it is hampering liberty and making it impossible for entrepreneurs, a few wealthy entrepreneurs, to really take off. Now, interestingly enough, I keep saying the word entrepreneurs. In fact, people starting out businesses like the liberal consensus. So one of my favorite pieces of information here actually comes from one of my readers who I met this way. He's a Securities and Exchange Commission lawyer. And he always likes to point out that we get securities, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, not because leading businessmen wanted it, and certainly not because little poor people wanted it, because who knew what securities even were. We got that because people trying to get onto Wall Street, trying to start businesses, recognized that they couldn't break into any fields unless the playing field was level. If you had the head of the stock exchange picking winners and losers, for example, it wasn't a question of whether or not you had a good idea. It was a question of whether or not you had cocktails with the guy. And so they wanted the playing field to be held level by a third party, by the government, in order for entrepreneurship really to flourish. So that is what's going on with all of those things. All right, I have probably bored you all to sleep, but I love the ideology behind this stuff. Okay, so let me get to some other things here quickly that speak to this. So here's a problem, and I'm going to see if I can tie this in as well. So here's a problem for people who believe in getting rid of this liberal consensus, the idea that the government, small L liberal, the idea I've talked before about how we get liberal as an epithet. The idea that government should regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, and promote infrastructure. So there's a real problem for people who oppose that, because Americans like that. You know, they think that's what we're doing. They like that. They want that. So what are you going to do? Well, you need to control the media that people see. You need to make sure that people are not hearing that you're actually going to destroy things they like. That you need to hear another version of that, the idea that in fact taxes are bad and the government is bad and all that has to be taken down. And the problem with that is that Americans have never agreed with that. I mean, there's certainly things we all don't like. You can probably make a list as long as your arm of programs that you would get rid of. But there's a list as long as your other arm that you would keep. So how do you sell that? Well, you sell that by limiting the information that people can have, by limiting the media. You also sell it, by the way, by manipulating the vote, which I may or may not get to. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like what I wrote about in the Letters from an American last night, simply promulgating news stories that are false. I mean, I thought it was really shocking. That's not the letter I wanted to write last night. I actually had another letter halfway done about the legal things that are going on right now. And I kept seeing these tweets that were just lies. And if you have to lie like that, if you have to change the words of a man who has lost his voice to a disease, like where are you? Yeah, I mean, that where you are is you're at a place where you need to manipulate what people understand to be the truth. Mind you, we all make mistakes, and politicians all spin. That's the way it's done. But this is to a new level. So that's one angle of how you manipulate that. But another angle of how you manipulate people into supporting you when you're going to attack things they care about. And by the way, I don't adhere to the false consciousness idea, which is a theory that comes out of the left, the intellectual left. I actually don't adhere to that. If anybody is listening to me and thinking, oh, she's a Marxist, I'm not a Marxist. I actually come at it from a very different angle, from linguistic theory, and from history, and from Eisenhower and Eric Hoffer. You've heard me talk about him before. But the other way you do that is by silencing journalists. And so now I'm going to go to another question. And of course, I'm sure you saw that the White House tweeted the other day that it's keeping folders on, especially David Farenthold, who has been very good about following down where money goes when it goes near the Trump White House. And they said we're keeping a file on him. And we know as of about 3 years ago that there is an organization, at least that there was then an office in the White House that was keeping dossiers on people that they considered to be social media influencers and journalists, which is very disturbing. But this brings me to another question here by Marianne Ryan. And she says, are there any updates to the Voice of America story that I talked about before? And that, if you recall, was that the head of Voice of America and her deputy both resigned when the White House put in charge of the Voice of America, which is a series of media products. They put in charge of that a guy named Michael Pack, who was an associate of Steve Bannon's, and it was pretty clear that Pack was going to go ahead and try and change the way that Voice of America covered stories coming out of America, primarily stories that did not, that were ones that Donald Trump didn't like, primarily about the coronavirus. That's what really upset him most, was the fact that Voice of America was critical of his handling of the coronavirus. So he gets put in place, and I wrote about that, and I wrote about the fact these people stepped down, and a lot of people were nervous about it. But when I wrote, there had at the time been no obvious changes to the Voice of America. So and PAC insisted he was going to be good. He did do a fairly clean sweep of some of the offices, but it looked as if things were stable. And I don't know about you guys. I'm always suspicious of everybody, but you know, like a lot of people you're suspicious of, but they end up coming through. That's kind of how it works. So like putting Senator Marco Rubio in charge of the Senate Intelligence Committee after Burr stepped down. You know, I'm not a huge fan of Rubio, but he has a pretty good reputation about being honest in terms of intelligence. And so, yeah, when the Fifth Senate report came out last week, which I am going to do a big post on, I've talked about it, I'm going to do a big post on it. He said, oh, it has nothing in it, which was a complete lie. It's a bombshell. But he did bring the thing out, so you got to give him credit. So anyway, this with PAC, I was kind of like, well, let's wait and see. I don't like the look of him on paper, but who knows? Anyway, here's the rest of the story. As Marianne Ryan asked. So one of the things that the Voice of America has done is that Voice of America employs journalists from around the world. And in order to employ those journalists from around the world, they get visas. And they get visas to go ahead and live in the U.S. and work for the Voice of America. Under PAC, he is apparently permitting the visas of the more than a dozen journalists who have come to America to work here for the Voice of America. He is letting their visas expire, which means that they are going to have to go. I mean, they haven't expired yet, so maybe he's going to step in. Maybe he's just thinking this over, but they're going to have to go home, and that sounds like it might not be a huge deal, except the fact that many of them will be going home to places where their work for Voice of America will endanger their lives. So why do you do this? Why does one do this? Representative Eliot Engel, who is the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has complained about this, and he has insisted that they explain what on earth they are doing. But shockingly enough, the Voice of America under PAC and the White House are ignoring him. Usually it's routine. You just have a routine visa renewal. And there are roughly 80 foreign journalists for the Voice of America. And right now, 16 of them, their visas are expiring. So why does one do this? One does this to silence journalists and to harass journalists and to make it clear that if you are going to stand against Donald Trump, or if you're going to write against Donald Trump with this ideology that he embraces, you're going to be in danger, that the government will not protect you and you will be sent home. So if you do that and you manage to get rid of any journalists who are critical of the Trump administration or of this ideology that the administration embraces, what you end up with is a sanitized media that is essentially propaganda. It's a state media. Now, the leap here, not really a leap, one of the things, if you're watching what's happening in Belarus right now, where there's a turmoil going on, one of the things that has happened under the pressure coming from Putin and the Russian regime is ... they're expelling all the foreign journalists, which is a huge deal. So what that means is what happens in Belarus can't really be reported on or overseen by people who are not in danger of from the Putin's heavy-handedness there. So what's happening in Voice of America continues to be very disturbing. So there is your answer to that, Marianne. All right, so there's a couple of quickies here I will do, and then I will maybe get to some of these others. Diane Gage wanted to know why on earth the DNC used Donna Hilton in a video. Because Donna Hilton was a woman who was accused of, convicted of, and served a sentence for heinous crimes. And by the way, I think heinous actually has a legal definition, and I don't use it that way. I'm using it in the social sense. I believe it was rape, murder, and something, arson. I don't know. You could look her up. It's Hilton, Hylton. So why on earth did the Democratic National Committee decide to put her in a video at the Democratic National Convention? And the answer to that, I think, is actually really interesting. And I don't know. I have no inside information. But here's, as a historian, what I saw. What she represented was twofold. First of all, it was redemption. It was the idea that if you have served your term in America, if you have served your sentence, you are you are welcome back in society. Because Hilton went on to start a major social welfare program. She really has become a major figure in the progressive community, and tried to make up for what she did as a young woman, or what I don't actually know the details of her case. So she was supposed to be a representative of redemption, of the idea that America is inclusive and that you can rewrite your life. So there is that. But here's the other piece that's really interesting. Remember how many people in America have gone to prison. We are living what people know as the carceral state. We chuck people into prison at an unbelievable rate in this country. And so one of the things that highlighting a success story did is it welcomed back into the political, both the country, but also the Democratic political coalition, people who had served time in prison. Okay, so it was a political act to have her do that, as everything in every convention is. That's kind of the whole point. But here's the next step of that, and that's that, remember, Trump did the same thing. I mean, he pardoned John Ponder, and Mr. Ponder had gone to prison for robbing a bank. Now, it was not robbing a bank, so there was a gun involved. It was not a personal crime like rape and murder or whatever it was that Hilton had done. But it was the same idea, the idea that he is now, because he did his time and he went on to become, to start a program for helping inmates transition back, former inmates transition back into society. Trump actually pardoned him at the Republican National Committee. So they're doing the exact same thing. And one of the things that when you see people saying, how could you have this rapist and murderer or whatever Hilton did, look her up if you're going to make this argument. The answer is Trump did the exact same thing. And he did it, I think, not because, and from my point of view, I suspect I'm editorializing, but there's an awful lot of evidence to this point, not because he really cares about the inclusion of people like Mr. Ponder in American society again, but rather because he really would like some of those votes, because he's desperate for votes anywhere. And he's tried again and again and again, as you know, to pick up more of the African-American vote. And one of the things that the trolls and bots, largely originating apparently in Russia right now, are trying to do is to weaken the African-American vote from its support of Joe Biden. It's why we have Kanye West running sort of a mercurial political campaign, and also the flooding of disinformation into African-American voters. All right, so that's what's going on with that. Let me see what else you guys might want to know here. I do want to talk about the future of political parties, which is people are asking about, but I've only got like 5 minutes, so that's not going to happen. I talked about platforms. Let me see if I'm going to do this one. I wish I could let you guys vote, because there's two that are running neck and neck here. I guess I'm going to go with this one because people might not be as interested in it as they are in other things. So Actually, Vicky Lenti asked, people ask, what have the Democrats done? And what I would suggest, I'm not going to go big for the country as opposed to Trump. I'm not going to make a long list here, but I would suggest to you right now, the Republicans embrace that ideology that Trump embodies and that Mitch McConnell certainly embodies, the idea that the government is best when it does nothing, when it just lets those rich guys free to do whatever they want, because that's how you move society forward. The Democrats believe in this liberal consensus, the idea that the government has a role to play in leveling the playing field between the haves and the have-nots, if you will. And so you can divide things through like that. Now, that was not the case until Reagan. That traditional Republicans, Eisenhower Republicans, George H.W. Bush Republicans, those guys also believed in the liberal consensus. They have now been culled out of the party, and they have become the never-Trumpers, basically. That's a little bit of a fudge, but they have become the never-Trumpers because they're willing to, not all of them are never-Trumpers, by the way. I'm sorry, not all the never-Trumpers are traditional Republicans at all. Some of them still believe in the movement, in movement conservatism, but some of them are. All right, so I'm going to take one last question here, and I can let you go. So I can let you guys all go. And this is Laura Eckhard asked me to explain the terms right and left, and I love this question, and I will try to be brief about it. Because actually I haven't written one of my lectures for tomorrow. I'm giving 2 totally cool lectures tomorrow. One is written and it is so cool. The other one I hope is going to be as cool, but right now it ain't written. So I got to go too. Anyway, Laura asked me to explain the terms right and left in the political spectrum. How great a question is that? Like the reason I love this question is because right now, there's kind of this idea that if you're a Republican, you're on the right, and if you're a Democrat, you're on the left. But what the heck does that even mean? Because Republicans and Democrats have policies, but right and left is like kind of, what does that even mean? Like it's kind of a persuasion-ish sort of thing. And I always have a problem with terms like that. And I'm going to introduce another term here too, which is the term conservative, which I said I wanted to come back here. So what does right and left mean? The actual terms right and left come to us from the French Revolution, as does the idea of conservatism in political thought, which I hope I'll have a chance to tell you a little bit about. Conservatism, small c. And I do have time. All right. So it literally means there's an aisle down the middle of the French Assembly. And the people on the right are the ones who supported the king, and the people on the left are the ones who didn't, who supported the popular assembly. So literally, when we got right and left, right supported the monarchy, left supported the people. The French Revolution is a mess. I mean, every revolution is a mess. I'm sorry. Looking from the front of the stage. So I just didn't give you a direction. So it's to the right of the speaker, to the left of the speaker. People on the right are supportive of the king. People on the left are supportive of the people. All right. So we don't have a king. So what does that even mean, right? The way we get to using these terms now is kind of complicated. So I'm going to give that to you, but I'm going to give you a middle stage first. So the French Revolution is really interesting. And as I say, it's very complicated. And I hate to sound really stupid, but it's actually really important because it does all kinds of things, both to Europe and to America, of course, but also to the way societies think about political power. And that's the only reason I'm interested in it. I hate to say that to all my French colleagues, the people who study the French Revolution. I mean, I'm interested in the way people look at what appears to be, and I use appears to be because I am not a specialist in France, but because that's how they look at it, at least from America and from England, what appears to be a struggle between monarchy, which of course is in real trouble in 1789, because the American Revolution in 1776 said, hey, dudes, we don't need a monarchy. We are all created equal. Now, I'm not going to talk about how the caveats to that, but what really that Thomas Paine's Common Sense does is it says, what's this with a monarchy? I mean, that's just bonkers. And I paraphrase, by the way. And so do many Enlightenment thinkers who begin to talk about the idea of government being a social compact. And that's where we get the real influence of people like John Locke, the idea that, if you heard of him, he says, let's rethink this whole king thing. Mind you, he's not a leveler at all, but he's like, what's this idea of hereditary monarchy? No. So government is a social compact. And the Americans have written a new government based on the Lockean idea of what a government is supposed to do. So now you get the French Revolution, and the regular people are taking that a step further, and they're literally taking over government, which didn't happen in America. It was a very conservative, a revolution. I don't want to use the word conservative yet. I'm going to give it to you in a second. It's a very socially unrested, not the social order was not overturned by the American Revolution. The French Revolution looked like it was going to overturn the social order through violence, among other things. Anyway, so there's this whole idea out there of what's called Lockean liberalism, this idea that, you have a social compact and that you don't have a hereditary monarchy, and you do certainly have an ordered society, but people like Edmund Burke in England, who had supported the American Revolution, looked at what's happening in France, and he's like, oh, hey, we got a problem here. He becomes known as the father of modern conservatism, small c. And I hate to do this to you so late. I've got like a minute or two left because I do it exactly an hour from when I actually start. Today's people who call themselves conservatives would make Burke roll in his grave. And the reason for that is because when Burke talked about conservatism, and he doesn't actually use that term, that's what people start to associate with him. What he says is like, look at what's happening in France. This is not what we want for a society, because they're actually cutting off people's heads. So what a government should actually do is not govern by ideology. You must not try to govern by ideology, because when you do that, soon the government goes to be enthralled to your ideology rather than having your ideology reflect reality. He says governing by ideology is a mistake. A true conservative in the Burkean sense says do not govern by ideology. Now, what did I just tell you about with Donald Trump and Social Security and the idea that if you just got rid of taxes and regulation and all that, the government would go wild, or the country would go wild? That's governing by ideology. Burke would take a look at that today and say, how are they different than people in the French Revolution? Because in the French Revolution, according to Burke, and I'm not judging the French Revolution, I don't know anything about it, but according to Burke, what's happening in the French Revolution is people are governing according to ideology, and they're killing people, and the country's going to, excuse me, sorry for the word, hell in a handbasket. So don't do that. What he says is that a government's job is to literally conserve. It is to conserve stability. So he believes in institutions that will protect stability. That means the family, church, socially stable communities. And he believes in, of course, in the law, so you can protect property, because you can't have property stability unless people are confident that, their home isn't going to be broken into. So he wants to conserve things that protect stability. And in order to do that, you got to look at conditions on the ground. You constantly have to be saying, oh, wait a minute, that law that was intended to, do X actually did Y. And so we got to get rid of that law and try something else, even though it's not something we wanted to do. If you think about it that way, he would look at FDR as a conservative. He would say FDR is governing according to what works. That is a conservative position. All right, so if that's what you've got there with liberal, traditionally, the idea of keeping the government small in order to make sure it doesn't overawe the individual, under Locke, and you have Burke saying, "Oh, let's slow down on this whole keeping the government small and turning people loose thing. Look what it's doing here. We need to conserve what's best about society." So where do we get here today? Obviously, modern day conservatives called themselves movement conservatives, capital M, capital C, because they were a political movement based in that ideology I talked to you about. They tarred everybody else as liberals. I've talked to you about that before. But how do we get back to right and left? We get back to right and left because in the 1960s, after the liberal consensus had taken off in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, everybody, they said, believed in this liberal consensus, a new right emerged. And that new right appeared in 1964 during the presidential campaign of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, in which they said that they were pushing back against that liberalism of FDR of the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, the idea that that government had a role to play in regulation and social welfare and building up the state. And infrastructure. And that new right said that it was going to really sort of weaponize these ideas of family and religion and turn them into a way to fight back against the New Deal state and to destroy that state and take it back to the 1920s. So they call themselves the New Right, even though their conservatism is based in that ideology. It's really quite a sleight of hand. And in opposition to the New Right, we get this broad social movement in America, and it's got a political side as well, but it's basically a social movement in the 1960s and the 1970s that is known as the New Left. And the New Left is less a political ideology, although it is that as well, than it is a defense of people who have previously been marginalized in society. So it tends to be people who campaign for social issues, for gay rights, for African American rights, for abortion rights, for loosening of drug policies and things like that. So nowadays, right and left in America has taken on this weird. Right is people who wants to go back to the 1920s, even though they're really not. They call themselves conservative. They're not conservative, and they really don't reflect. Maybe they reflect a monarchy, but we don't have one. So do what you will with that. And the left is they call themselves for the people. And as I say, there's a political component of that, but their political goals are really much more within that tradition of the liberal consensus, the idea that the government has a role to play in leveling the playing field between marginalized peoples and those who are not. That was quite a riff, wasn't it? I love this stuff. All right, it's been an hour, my time. I hope I didn't bore you guys. And I hope I got some juice left to lecture double tomorrow. I think I know what I'm going to write in my lecture tonight, though. All right, again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. If you are interested in them, I do Tuesdays, the history behind politics, and on Tuesdays at 4 o'clock. And on Thursdays at 1 o'clock, I do a history session. We are currently working our way through the Republican Party, and I think we're up to the Clinton years. I think we're doing the Clinton years. So this week, I think, is the rise of Fox News and the Clinton impeachment and the Starr report. I don't quite know where we're going to go, how far we're going to go. Anyway, thank you for being here, and I'll see you next week.